Pretend to be sick and get off this plane. Right now." The flight attendant whispered those words without looking at me as she checked the overhead bin above seat 12A. I was 71 years old, halfway into my seat on Flight 417 to Honolulu, and until that moment, I had been looking forward to 10 quiet days in Hawaii with my son Nathan and his wife Paige. Then I saw the flight attendant's hand trembling. "Don't ask questions," she whispered. "Just trust me. You cannot be on this plane when it takes off." She moved down the aisle before I could answer. "My name is Howard Ellison. I taught chemistry for 40 years, and if there's one thing the laboratory taught me, it's that when new evidence contradicts what you believe, you don't ignore the evidence." So I didn't. I grabbed my chest. "Nathan." My son turned from the window seat. "Dad?" I sucked in a sharp breath and let my body fold forward. "Something's wrong." Paige leaned across him. For half a second, neither of them moved. That half second would haunt me later. "My chest," I gasped. "I can't breathe." The flight attendant immediately called for assistance. Within minutes, 2 crew members were beside me, while passengers watched from their seats. Nathan finally stood. "Dad, are you sure?" "Maybe it's just anxiety." I stared at him. My 71-year-old father tells me he can't breathe, and my first instinct isn't get him help. It's, "Are you sure?" "Sir, we're taking you off the aircraft," the attendant said. That was when Paige spoke. "Does he really need to get off?" "We're about to depart." I almost forgot to keep acting. The crew didn't give her a choice. They brought a wheelchair and moved me toward the front door. As we passed row 12, I looked back at my son. Nathan wasn't following. "Aren't you coming?" I asked. He glanced at Paige. She answered for him. "We'll miss the flight, Howard. Your father may be having a heart attack." Paige's expression tightened. "There are doctors here. We'll meet you in Honolulu once you're cleared." Then I saw something on Nathan's face that frightened me more than anger would have. Relief mixed with disappointment, as though something important had gone wrong, but he wasn't sure how to fix it. The wheelchair reached the aircraft door. Behind me, Paige lowered her voice, apparently believing I was too far away to hear. I wasn't. "This ruins everything." I turned my head. Nathan said something I couldn't make out. Then the door closed between us. My son and daughter-in-law flew to Hawaii, while I was taken to the airport medical station alone. If a stranger ever warned you that someone you love might not be who you think they are, would you listen? Subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. 20 minutes later, the airport medic finished examining me. My pulse was normal, blood pressure slightly elevated, but nothing dangerous. "Your heart looks fine," he said. "Whatever happened seems to have passed." Of course it had. There had never been chest pain. But I couldn't stop thinking about 3 things. Paige, asking whether I really needed to leave. Nathan staying in his seat. And those 4 words, "This ruins everything." When the medic stepped out, the door opened again. The flight attendant entered. Her name tag read Renata. She shut the door behind her. The calm, professional expression she'd worn on the aircraft was gone. "I'm sorry I scared you." "You didn't scare me," I said. "My son did." She looked down. "Mr. Ellison, I heard something before boarding." "From Nathan?" She hesitated. "From your daughter-in-law." I waited. Renata reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. I recorded part of it because I thought I must have misunderstood. "Recorded what?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked a question that made the room suddenly feel much colder. "Do you have a life insurance policy?" I stared at her. "Yes." "Does your son know how much it's worth?" I felt my stomach tighten. "Why?" Renata unlocked her phone. "Because your daughter-in-law mentioned a number." She turned the screen toward me. An audio file was waiting. "How much?" I asked. Renata looked directly into my eyes. $650,000. That was the exact value of my policy. I had never told Paige. And as I stared at the recording on a stranger's phone, I understood that getting off Flight 417 hadn't ended the danger. It had only given me enough time to find out why my own family had expected me to stay on it. 3 days before Flight 417, Hawaii still looked like a gift. Nathan and Paige arrived at my house carrying dinner and an envelope. Since Margaret died 5 years earlier, my son rarely visited without calling first, so the surprise alone caught my attention. Inside were 3 tickets to Honolulu and reservations for 10 nights at a beachfront resort. "Everything's paid for," Nathan said. "You just need to pack." I looked at the departure date. "You bought these before asking me?" Paige smiled. "We knew you'd say yes." I wanted to believe this was Nathan's attempt to reconnect. He was my only child, and losing Margaret had created distance between us that neither of us knew how to repair. So I agreed. The next morning, Paige came over to help me pack. She was unusually interested in my medications. "Anything for your heart?" she asked. "No." "Blood pressure?" "1 prescription." She picked up the bottle and studied the label before putting it down. Then she asked whether I kept my pills in their original containers when traveling. "Why does that matter?" "Long flight. I'm just making sure you're prepared." A few minutes later, she noticed an insurance statement on my desk. "Nathan's still your beneficiary, right?" I looked up. "Why are we discussing my life insurance?" "We're not. I was just curious." But she kept going. "What's the policy worth now?" I didn't answer. Paige smiled, as though the question meant nothing. 600,000? Maybe more? The actual figure was $650,000. I had never told her. That evening, Nathan stopped by alone, and I decided to test his reaction. I might cancel Hawaii. His expression changed immediately. "Why?" "I've had some tightness in my chest." Instead of asking whether I was all right, Nathan went still. "Did you tell anyone?" "No." "Did you see a doctor?" "Not yet." "Then don't cancel until you know what it is." I studied him. "You think I should fly 8 hours with chest pain?" "I'm saying you shouldn't overreact." The following morning, I told him the discomfort had disappeared. His relief was immediate. "Good, then we're still going." By then, I had several observations I couldn't comfortably explain. The tickets had been purchased before I agreed. Paige was interested in my medications and insurance. Nathan seemed more worried about preserving the trip than about my supposed chest pain. None of it was proof. For 40 years, I'd taught my chemistry students that a theory wasn't a conclusion. You collected observations, tested them, and looked for a pattern. So I kept watching. On the morning of the flight, Paige arrived early and insisted on handling my suitcase. At the airport, she asked twice whether my medication was in my carry-on. While Nathan checked our luggage, I noticed Paige typing quickly on her phone. When she saw me looking, she immediately locked the screen. "Something wrong?" I asked. "Not at all." At the gate, Nathan barely spoke. Paige kept checking the departure board even though Flight 417 was on time. When boarding finally began, she smiled and whispered, "Finally." Maybe it meant nothing. By itself, almost everything I'd noticed could mean nothing. But science had taught me that independent anomalies become harder to dismiss when they all point in the same direction. As we walked down the jet bridge, I deliberately slowed down. Nathan didn't notice. Paige did. "Howard, come on. We don't want to hold things up." There was an urgency in her voice I hadn't heard during the entire trip planning. Once aboard, Nathan took the window seat, Paige the middle, and I sat on the aisle. I pushed my carry-on beneath the seat. Paige immediately looked down. "Your pills are in there?" I turned toward her. "You've asked me that 3 times. I'm trying to take care of you." "Since when does taking care of me require knowing exactly where my medication is?" Her smile tightened. "You're reading too much into this." Maybe I was. I wanted desperately to be. Then I noticed a flight attendant near the front of the cabin watching Paige. Not casually. Watching her. When our eyes met, the woman looked away immediately. A minute later, she began checking the overhead compartments and slowly worked her way toward our row. I didn't know her name was Renata. I didn't know she'd heard Paige speaking before we boarded. I only knew that when she reached seat 12A, her professional smile disappeared. She leaned toward me as though checking the compartment above my head, and the fear in her eyes told me that whatever I'd been noticing for the last 3 days was no longer just suspicion. Renata pressed play. For the first few seconds, all I heard was airport noise, rolling suitcases, distant announcements, voices echoing against tile. Then Paige's voice came through clearly. "The capsules dissolve fast enough. By the time anyone realizes something's wrong, we'll already be in the air." I stopped breathing. Another voice answered. "Too faint for me to identify." Paige continued. At altitude, it should look like a cardiac event. He's 71. Nobody's going to question it immediately. Renata watched my face but said nothing. The recording continued. Paige mentioned a delay before certain tests would be performed and said the timing was important. Then came the sentence that turned suspicion into something far darker. 650,000 makes the risk worth it. My hands went cold. That was the exact value of my life insurance policy. Not approximately, not a guess. Exactly. Renata paused the recording. Is that the amount? Yes. My voice barely came out. Who else knows? My attorney, the insurance company, Nathan. Saying my son's name changed something inside me. Renata looked uncomfortable. There's more. She pressed play again. Paige's voice returned. Nathan's nervous, but he's committed. Once we're over the Pacific, there's no turning back. I reached across the table and stopped the recording myself. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. I had spent 3 days trying to explain away every strange detail, because the alternative was too ugly to accept. The prepaid vacation, Paige's questions about my pills, her knowledge of the insurance policy, Nathan's reaction when I mentioned chest pain. Now those pieces had a shape. Where did you record this? I asked. Renata explained that before boarding she'd entered the women's restroom near our gate and heard Paige speaking from inside a stall. At first she assumed it was some strange medical conversation. Then she heard my flight number, my age, and the words cardiac event. She started recording. When she later saw Paige board with an older man, she understood who the conversation was about. I didn't know whether I was overreacting, she said. Then I saw her checking your bag and watching you take your seat. So you warned me. I couldn't let that plane take off with you on it. I looked at her phone again. Send me the original file. Don't edit it. Don't rename it. Renata raised an eyebrow. You sound like an investigator. Chemistry teacher. 40 years. I almost smiled, but couldn't. Same principle. Preserve the evidence. She sent me the file and made a second backup. Then she said, we need to call airport police. Every rational part of me knew she was right. But another question had already taken hold. If Paige intended to harm me on Flight 417, how had she gotten the information? How long had she been planning it? And what exactly did Nathan's committed mean? Not yet. Renata stared at me. Mr. Ellison, they may have tried to kill you. Which is exactly why I need to know what I'm dealing with before they realize I know. That's dangerous. So, is confronting two people when I don't know how much they've already done. I asked her not to contact Nathan or Paige. She reluctantly agreed, but only after I promised to involve my attorney immediately. Before leaving, she said something I couldn't forget. When you were taken off the plane, your daughter-in-law looked angry. Your son looked scared. Neither of them looked surprised. After she left, I sat alone in the medical room and played the recording once more. This time, I listened like a scientist instead of a father. I wrote down every usable phrase: capsules, dissolve, altitude, cardiac event, testing delay, $650,000. Nathan's committed. 7 pieces of data. 7 reasons not to explain this away. My phone buzzed. A message from Nathan appeared. Dad, hope you're okay. We'll call when we land. I stared at those words for a long time. An hour earlier, I would have read concern in them. Now, I wondered whether he was checking that I was still alive or checking how much I knew. I typed, I'm fine, then deleted it. If Nathan believed I was confused and frightened, I wanted him to keep believing it. I turned off my phone and looked at the empty chair where Renata had been sitting. For 40 years, I'd taught students never to force evidence to fit the conclusion they wanted. Now the evidence was forcing me toward a conclusion I desperately didn't want. My daughter-in-law had discussed my death, and my own son might have agreed to it. But one recording still couldn't tell me how far the plan reached. To answer that, I needed to stop thinking like Nathan's father and start examining my life like a crime scene. And the first place I needed to look was home. I returned home while Nathan and Paige were still flying over the Pacific. I had only a few hours before they landed, and I intended to use every minute. I started with the number Paige should never have known, $650,000. I logged into my life insurance account and checked the beneficiary history. Nathan was listed as the sole beneficiary. That alone wasn't strange. The date was. The change had been made 4 months earlier. I hadn't touched the policy in years. I downloaded the authorization form and enlarged the signature. It looked like mine until I studied it carefully. The angle of the H was wrong. The final stroke curved upward. Someone had copied my signature well enough to fool a clerk, but not well enough to fool me. I printed the document and placed it beside Renata's recording. Then I opened my bank records. At first, everything looked normal. The suspicious transfers were small, $1,850 here, $975 there, $2,400 somewhere else. Individually, they were easy to miss. Together, they formed a pattern. I exported 12 months of transactions and added every transfer I couldn't identify. The total was $41,380. I stared at the number. Whoever had taken the money hadn't wanted to empty my accounts. They wanted to drain them slowly enough that a 71-year-old widower might blame his own memory. That thought led me to my legal documents. Nathan had helped organize my paperwork after Margaret died, so he'd had access to information most people never saw. Inside my estate folder, I found a durable power of attorney, dated 6 months earlier. It granted Nathan broad authority over my finances and property if I became incapacitated. My signature appeared at the bottom. I had never signed it. I had never met the notary listed beneath it. Insurance. Money. Legal control. 3 separate pieces now pointed in the same direction, but the 4th was worse. I logged into my medical portal and found notes describing a Howard Ellison I didn't recognize. According to those records, I had become forgetful. I'd confused medications. I'd gotten disoriented while driving. One note even suggested possible cognitive decline and recommended that family members monitor my financial decisions. None of it had happened. I checked the dates. On one supposed appointment day, I'd been giving a lecture at a community college. Yet the record claimed Nathan had accompanied me to a medical evaluation. I sat back and finally understood why the theft had been done in small amounts, why the power of attorney depended on incapacity, why Paige cared about my medication, why Nathan had asked whether anyone knew about the chest pain I'd invented. They weren't merely preparing to inherit from me. They were building a second version of my life, a confused old widower whose memory couldn't be trusted. If I noticed the missing $41,380, they could say I'd forgotten spending it. If I challenged the insurance form, they could say I'd forgotten signing it. And if I accused my own son and daughter-in-law of discussing my death on Flight 417, they could point to a medical file already describing me as cognitively unstable. That realization hurt more than the money. Nathan was my only child. I had taught him to ride a bicycle, paid his college tuition, and stood beside him when he married Paige. Now his name appeared throughout a paper trail designed to make me powerless. My phone rang. Nathan. Their plane had landed. I let the first call go unanswered. He called again. This time I picked up. Dad, where are you? Home. You went back home? His surprise was immediate. The doctor said I was fine. Paige spoke in the background, too quietly for me to understand. Nathan lowered his voice. Maybe we should come back. I'm worried about you being alone. A day earlier, those words might have comforted me. Now I wondered what they meant, so I tested him. Maybe you're right, I said slowly. I've been a little confused lately. Nathan became quiet. Then his voice softened. That's okay, Dad. Just rest. We'll handle things when we get back. We'll handle things. Not, what are you confused about? Not, do you need a doctor? He sounded almost relieved. Enjoy Hawaii, I said, and ended the call. Then I photographed every document, saved copies in separate locations, and wrote the dates in chronological order. Medical notes. Power of attorney. Beneficiary change. Missing money. Flight 417. When I arranged them on the table, I no longer saw isolated, suspicious events. I saw preparation. Someone had been constructing this for months, perhaps longer. I had spent 40 years teaching students that when independent pieces of evidence repeatedly support the same hypothesis, eventually you have to stop calling it coincidence. I wasn't ready to accuse Nathan publicly. Not yet. I needed someone who understood what these documents could actually do to me, if they were allowed to stand. I looked at the forged power of attorney one last time, opened my contacts, and found the name of the attorney I'd trusted for years. Miriam Vance. The next morning I was going to put everything on her desk. Miriam Vance didn't tell me I was overreacting. That frightened me more than if she had. I arrived at her office at 8 the next morning carrying copies of the insurance form, bank transfers, power of attorney, medical records, and Renata's audio file. Miriam listened without interrupting. When the recording ended, she removed her glasses and said, "Howard, from this moment forward, you don't confront Nathan or Paige about anything. You believe this is real? I believe we preserve first and interpret second." That was language I understood. We copied every file to an encrypted drive, documented where each record came from, and preserved Renata's original recording. Miriam also told me not to change my normal routine yet. If Nathan and Paige believed I knew nothing, they might keep making mistakes. Then I remembered Nathan's old laptop. He had left it at my house months earlier, after buying a new one. Miriam wouldn't touch it until we established that it had been abandoned in my possession and could be examined lawfully. Once that was settled, a forensic technician created a copy of the drive rather than altering the original. What he recovered changed the case. Buried among deleted messages were emails between Nathan and someone describing himself as a wellness consultant. The language was careful, but not careful enough. Nathan asked about a compound that could place severe stress on the cardiovascular system. Another message asked whether altitude could make the symptoms appear naturally occurring. A third asked how long traces might remain detectable. The consultant replied with timing, information, and a price, $12,000. I read the exchange twice. "Is this enough?" I asked. Miriam shook her head. "Enough to investigate, not enough to start guessing beyond what we can prove." Then the technician recovered another file, a draft Will created several months earlier. According to it, nearly everything I owned would eventually pass to Nathan and Paige. The signature block contained another imitation of my name. I had never seen the document. Why would they need this if Nathan already benefits from the insurance? I asked. Miriam arranged the evidence across her desk. The forged beneficiary form, the power of attorney, the false medical notes, the missing $41,380, the consultant emails, and now the draft will. "Because these documents solve different problems," she said. She pointed to the insurance and will. "If you die, these control where the money goes." Then she tapped the medical records and power of attorney. "If you don't die, these can be used to argue that you can't control your own affairs." I stared at the papers. Suddenly, the design became clear. Flight 417 hadn't been their only route to my assets. It was simply the fastest. If something went wrong, they already had another structure forming beneath it. So if I accuse them, they may claim you're confused and use the medical records as proof. Miriam nodded. "Which is why we don't give them a reason to accelerate anything until we're ready." I thought about my short conversation with Nathan the night before. I'd told him I felt confused, and instead of sounding alarmed, he'd told me to rest and said, "We'll handle things." At the time it had felt wrong. Now it felt useful. "He already thinks I'm slipping," I said. Miriam looked at me carefully. "What exactly did you tell him?" I explained. For the first time that morning, she leaned back and considered something other than the documents. "Then don't correct that assumption. You want me to let my son think I'm losing my mind? I want you to stop giving him new information. If they believe their existing narrative is working, they may reveal what they intend to do next." That idea should have disgusted me. Instead, it made sense. In a laboratory, when you wanted to understand a reaction, you didn't keep disturbing the sample. You controlled the conditions and observed what happened. Nathan and Paige had spent months creating a fictional Howard Ellison, forgetful, dependent, increasingly incapable of managing his own life. For the first time, that fiction could work in my favor. Before I left, Miriam gave me 3 instructions. Secure my real medication, preserve every message, and never meet Nathan or Paige without a record of what happened. And Howard, she added, don't underestimate them because they're family. I looked at the forged will lying beside her hand. I already made that mistake. That afternoon, Nathan texted from Hawaii. How are you feeling today? Still confused? I stared at the screen. My first instinct was to tell him exactly how clear my mind had become. Instead, I typed, a little. Probably just tired. His reply came less than a minute later. Don't worry, Dad. We'll take care of everything when we get home. I showed Miriam the message. Her response was only 4 words. Let them believe it. So I did. I wasn't going to confront Nathan about Flight 417. I wasn't going to mention the $12,000 emails, the forged will, or the documents already sitting safely in Miriam's office. When my son came home, he would find exactly the father he and Paige had spent months creating on paper. And this time, I would be watching them. For the next 2 weeks, I became the man Nathan and Paige had already created on paper. When they returned from Hawaii, I forgot small things in front of them. I asked Nathan what day it was twice during the same conversation. I stopped halfway through sentences and pretended I'd lost my thought. Once, while Paige was standing beside me in the kitchen, I opened the refrigerator and stared inside for 10 seconds. What was I looking for? I asked. Her concern appeared instantly. Howard, are you feeling confused again? A little. She touched my arm with almost convincing tenderness. You shouldn't be alone so much. Nathan watched from across the room. He didn't look frightened. He looked relieved. That told me to continue. But I wasn't careless. Miriam had arranged for my real medications to be secured, and I kept only harmless substitutes in the organizer Paige expected to see. I also had 12 security cameras installed throughout the house. Entrances, kitchen, living room, hallway, office, and garage. When Nathan noticed them, I told him I was worried about forgetting things. Maybe the cameras can help me remember. He loved the idea. That's smart, Dad. They'll help us keep an eye on you. Us. I smiled and thanked him. What Nathan didn't know was that every recording was backed up somewhere he couldn't access. The more helpless I appeared, the more comfortable they became. Paige began reminding me when to take my medication. Nathan asked whether I'd considered letting him handle my bills. I pretended to misunderstand simple statements and watched them exchange glances when they thought I wasn't looking. One afternoon, I deliberately left a stack of unopened mail on the counter. Paige picked it up. Howard, you can't let bills pile up like this. Did I forget them? Apparently. Nathan stepped closer. Maybe I should start managing this stuff. I nodded slowly. Maybe. That single word seemed to relax both of them. The breakthrough came 5 nights later. Nathan and Paige thought I'd gone to bed. Instead, I was sitting upstairs with headphones connected to the security system. Their voices came from the kitchen below. Paige spoke first. We can't keep waiting, Nathan answered. He's getting worse. Good, that helps us. I stopped breathing. Nathan lowered his voice. What about what happened on the plane? Paige was silent for a moment. Then she said, Flight 417 failed. Forget it. Hearing the flight number in my own kitchen removed the last tiny piece of doubt I'd been carrying. Paige continued. We moved to Plan B. And that is? Nathan asked. Incompetency. The word landed harder than I expected. Not because Miriam and I hadn't anticipated it, but because I was hearing my own family say it aloud. Paige explained that the medical records already showed a pattern. My recent confusion strengthened it. If they could establish that I was unable to manage my affairs, someone would need legal authority to make decisions for me. Nathan asked, You mean guardianship? Exactly. There was a pause. Then my son asked the question Miriam had been waiting for them to ask. How fast can we do it? I removed the headphones and sat perfectly still. For 71 years, I'd believed betrayal would feel explosive. It didn't. It felt cold, precise, almost clinical. My son wasn't asking whether I needed help. He was asking how quickly he could obtain control. I saved the recording in 3 locations and sent a copy to Miriam. She called 10 minutes later. Do not change your behavior. They just admitted it. Which means the strategy is working. How long do I keep pretending? Until they make the next move. The next morning, Nathan arrived with groceries I hadn't requested. I shuffled toward the kitchen and deliberately called him Michael, the name of an old colleague. He froze. Dad, who do you think I am? I stared at him as though searching my memory. Nathan. Of course. Sorry. He glanced at Paige. She gave the smallest nod. That tiny exchange told me everything. They believed they were watching me deteriorate. In reality, I was documenting them, becoming bolder. Later that afternoon, Nathan sat beside me and said, Dad, maybe we should have someone evaluate you, just to make sure you're safe. I looked confused. A doctor? Something like that. Do you think I'm sick? He squeezed my shoulder. We're just trying to protect you. Protect me. The same son who had helped create false records was now preparing to use them as proof. I smiled weakly. Whatever you think is best. Nathan relaxed immediately. After he left, I wrote down the exact conversation and called Miriam. They're moving. Good, she said. Now we find out who they're bringing in. 2 days later, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. The man on the other end introduced himself as Dr. Calloway and said Nathan had asked him to perform a cognitive evaluation. I wrote the name down without reacting. The trap had moved into its next stage. Dr. Calloway wanted to see me the following Tuesday. He said Nathan had contacted him because my family was concerned about recent cognitive changes. I wrote down every word, then called Miriam. She asked for the doctor's full name, office address, and phone number. 40 minutes later, she called back. Howard, I can't find a current medical license matching the credentials he's using. So, I don't go? Actually, I think you should. That surprised me. Miriam explained that if Nathan and Paige were trying to manufacture another piece of evidence, refusing the evaluation might only give them something else to use. Go. Answer carefully. Don't volunteer anything. And remember exactly what happens. On Tuesday morning, I arrived at a small office in a medical complex outside Greensboro. Calloway was in his late 50s, professionally dressed, with certificates on the wall that looked impressive, until you noticed none clearly identified him as a licensed neurologist or psychologist. He began with ordinary questions. My name, the date, the president, where I lived. I answered correctly. His expression barely changed. Then the questions became different. Your son says you've been forgetting medications. Did he? Have you ever taken the wrong pill? Not that I remember. Calloway wrote something down. So it's possible you've forgotten doing it? I understood the game immediately. Every answer was being turned toward the same conclusion. He asked whether I'd recently become confused while driving. I said no. He replied. But someone experiencing memory decline may not recognize those episodes, correct? I smiled. You're asking me to prove the absence of something I don't experience. He looked up sharply. For the next 30 minutes, I gave precise answers while he repeatedly tried to introduce Nathan's claims as facts. When the session ended, Calloway said, given your age and the concerns expressed by your family, further supervision may be appropriate. Did I fail any test? He hesitated. This isn't about passing or failing. That was enough for me. I walked outside and immediately dictated everything into my phone. Miriam already had the next step arranged. 2 days later, I met Dr. Annika Ralph, a forensic neuropsychologist with no connection to Nathan, Paige, or Calloway. Her evaluation lasted almost 3 hours. There were memory exercises, pattern recognition, delayed recall, mathematical reasoning, language tasks, and questions designed to detect whether someone was exaggerating either impairment or ability. I didn't pretend to be confused. For the first time in weeks, I behaved exactly like myself. When we finished, Dr. Ralph closed her notebook. Mr. Ellison, I'm not giving you a formal conclusion until I score everything, but I can tell you this. What I observed today is not consistent with the level of impairment described in the records you showed me. I drove home feeling something I hadn't felt since Flight 417. Solid ground beneath my feet. Nathan and Paige had paper. Now I had independent evidence. But they moved faster than Miriam expected. 4 days later, I was served with a petition seeking guardianship over me. Nathan claimed my cognitive condition had deteriorated rapidly and that I could no longer safely manage my finances or medical decisions. Attached were copies of the questionable medical notes, statements about my recent confusion, and an affidavit from a neighbor named Mrs. Carter. She claimed she'd seen me wandering outside at night appearing disoriented. I knew immediately something was wrong. Mrs. Carter lived 3 houses away and rarely saw me after sunset. Miriam interviewed her the next afternoon. The story changed quickly. Nathan had visited her first. He'd told her I was becoming seriously ill and asked whether she'd ever seen me outside looking confused. She remembered one evening months earlier when I'd walked to the mailbox after dark. Nathan had written the affidavit and brought it back for her signature. I thought I was helping, she admitted. Miriam documented everything. The preliminary hearing arrived 2 weeks later. Nathan sat across the courtroom beside Paige. They both looked concerned, almost sorrowful. If I hadn't known better, I might have believed them. Their attorney described me as an elderly widower, experiencing rapid cognitive decline and making uncharacteristic financial decisions, including restricting Nathan's access to accounts. There it was. My refusal to fund them had become evidence of illness. Miriam didn't reveal everything. She challenged the reliability of the records, presented proof that I continued managing my daily affairs, and requested a truly independent court evaluation before any guardianship decision. The judge agreed. The court will appoint a forensic specialist, she said. Paige leaned toward Nathan and whispered something. Then the judge read the name, Dr. Anika Ralph. I kept my face completely still. Across the aisle, Nathan didn't react because he had no idea I'd already spent nearly 3 hours with her. Paige didn't know either. Miriam glanced at me, but said nothing. For months, Nathan and Paige had depended on controlling the information around me, what doctors supposedly saw, what neighbors supposedly remembered, what documents supposedly proved. Now they had asked a court to examine my mind, and the court had unknowingly chosen the one expert who had already seen it clearly. I walked out without looking at my son. The next move no longer belonged to Nathan or Paige. It belonged to the evidence. Dr. Anika Ralph's court evaluation was scheduled for Thursday morning. Nathan and Paige arrived expecting a confused, 71-year-old man to confirm everything they'd spent months putting on paper. Instead, I walked into Dr. Ralph's office alone, sat across from her, and answered every question exactly as I had during our first meeting. She couldn't simply reuse her earlier conclusions. The court required an independent assessment under its own procedures. So we started again. Memory, delayed recall, numbers, language, reasoning, decision-making, financial scenarios. Nearly 3 hours later, she closed the final test booklet. Mr. Ellison, the court will receive my report directly. I nodded. That's all I want. 6 days later, Miriam called. Sit down before I read this. I was already standing in my kitchen. Read it. She paused. Full decisional capacity. No evidence of clinically significant cognitive decline. Superior analytical functioning for age. No clinical basis for guardianship. I closed my eyes. For weeks I deliberately acted like the man Nathan and Paige wanted everyone to believe I had become. 4 sentences from an independent expert had just separated that performance from reality. At the next hearing, Nathan's attorney tried to argue that cognitive decline could fluctuate. The judge wasn't persuaded. Dr. Ralph's report was detailed. The questionable medical records were now being challenged, and Mrs. Carter had withdrawn the meaning Nathan had attached to her statement. The guardianship petition was denied. Paige's face hardened. Nathan looked at me as though I had somehow cheated. I hadn't. They had demanded an examination of my mind. They simply hadn't expected it to prove I still controlled it. Miriam waited until we were outside before speaking. Now we secure everything. That afternoon we began closing every door they'd tried to open. The insurance company received formal notice disputing the forged beneficiary authorization and froze further changes while it investigated. The questionable power of attorney was challenged and revoked from any practical use. My bank placed enhanced verification on my accounts and removed every authorization I hadn't personally confirmed. Passwords changed. Security questions changed. Alerts were added to transfers. The remaining funds became unreachable, without my direct approval. Then Miriam reviewed my estate documents with me from the first page to the last. Nathan would no longer be in a position to control my affairs merely because he was my son. I wasn't doing it to punish him. I was making sure affection could never again be mistaken for authorization. When the paperwork was finished, Miriam spread the evidence across her conference table. This time, it no longer looked like scattered warning signs. It looked like a chain. First came the false medical narrative, then the forged power of attorney. Then the altered $650,000 beneficiary form. Then $41,380 in unexplained transfers. Then the Hawaii trip. Renata's recording. The consultant emails discussing cardiovascular stress, altitude, detection timing, and $12,000. The draft will. The recording from my kitchen. Flight 417 failed. Plan B. Incompetency. Then Calloway's evaluation and the guardianship petition. Miriam tapped the final page. Individually, they'll explain each one away. Together, they have a much bigger problem. I looked at the timeline. For months, Nathan and Paige had relied on one assumption. If I ever discovered what was happening, they could portray the discovery itself as evidence that I was confused. Dr. Ralph had destroyed that shield. My accusations could no longer be dismissed as the imagination of a declining old man. What happens now? I asked. Now we stop defending your competence and start documenting their conduct. Miriam had already preserved the original audio from Renata, requested authentication records from the bank and insurance company, and begun tracing the disputed documents. She also told me that any attempt by Nathan or Paige to destroy records after learning about the investigation could become evidence of its own. So, we tell them what we have? Not everything. Miriam gave me a thin smile. We tell them enough. I drove home that evening and sat at the same desk where I'd first discovered the forged insurance form. Nothing in the room had changed. But I had. 2 months earlier, I'd been trying to understand whether my own son could possibly be involved. Then I'd spent weeks pretending to be weak so he wouldn't know I was watching. That phase was over. My phone buzzed with a message from Nathan. Dad, we need to put all this behind us. Paige thinks everyone has misunderstood everything. Can we talk? I read it twice and forwarded it to Miriam. She called immediately. Don't answer tonight. I wasn't planning to. Good, because tomorrow we move. I looked at Margaret's photograph beside my desk. I had wanted evidence because part of me still hoped the evidence would prove my suspicions wrong. It hadn't. It had done the opposite. The guardianship had failed. My money was protected. My legal authority was secure. And for the first time since Renata whispered to me aboard Flight 417, Nathan and Paige no longer controlled the direction of events. I picked up the timeline Miriam had prepared and read it once more from beginning to end. Then I asked the only question that remained. Are we ready? Miriam's answer was immediate. Yes. I looked at the forged signatures, the transfers, the recordings, and the medical records that had nearly been used to erase my credibility. Then I'm done defending myself. I paused. Now we prosecute. The 52-page filing reached Nathan and Paige at 9/6 on a Monday morning. Miriam had included enough to make them understand that the guardianship case was no longer their biggest problem, but not enough to show them everything we had. By 9:41, the first security alert appeared on my phone. Nathan had entered the room where he'd left his old laptop. He opened it, connected an external drive, and began deleting files. 20 minutes later, Paige arrived, carrying a cardboard box filled with documents. She fed papers into a shredder while Nathan kept working at the computer. They had forgotten about the cameras. I sat in Miriam's office watching the footage live. Don't call them, she said. Let them finish. That was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. For months, I'd wanted to stop them. Now the smartest thing I could do was allow them to create more evidence. Nathan spent almost an hour deleting files that had already been forensically preserved. Paige filled 2 bags with shredded paper. Every minute was recorded. Miriam saved copies immediately. At 11:18, Nathan finally called me. Dad, what the hell is this? You received the filing? 52 pages? Fraud? Financial exploitation? You're accusing us of crimes. I'm documenting what happened. We can fix this without lawyers. Then explain the $41,380. Silence. I hadn't told him the exact total. That wasn't stealing, he said finally. You always helped me. I looked at Miriam. She wrote something on a legal pad and turned it toward me. He knows the number. I never authorized those transfers. Nathan's voice changed. I was going to put it back. All $41,380. Another silence. Then he said, Dad, please. I ended the call. 2 days later, Nathan asked to meet privately. Miriam insisted the conversation be documented. Nathan arrived looking as though he hadn't slept. Paige pushed things too far, he said almost immediately. Which things? The medical stuff, the guardianship, and Flight 417? His face changed. I don't know what you're talking about. Then we have nothing to discuss. He leaned forward. What do you want? The truth. What if we settle this? Settle what? Everything. We can return the money. Add something for your legal expenses. $100,000 total. I stared at him. You're offering me $100,000 to stop. I'm trying to keep this family from being destroyed. You should have thought about that before trying to take control of my life. Nathan left without answering. Miriam preserved the entire conversation. The pressure then began exposing things I hadn't known. Financial investigators found that Nathan had accumulated approximately $88,000 in gambling debt through credit cards, personal loans, and online betting accounts. The missing $41,380 suddenly had a motive. Paige had problems of her own. The medical facility connected to several questionable entries began an internal investigation into how information had been added or altered. Within days, Paige was placed on administrative leave, while access logs were reviewed. Their partnership started collapsing almost immediately. One evening, my cameras captured them arguing in my kitchen after they'd come to retrieve belongings Nathan had stored there. You said the medical records would be enough, Nathan snapped. Paige fired back. And you said Hawaii would solve the problem before any of this mattered? I froze the recording. Nathan lowered his voice. I never agreed to what you were planning on that plane. Don't do that now, Paige said. You knew exactly what the capsules were for. You said it would look natural. And you still got on Flight 417. There it was. No interpretation required. No forged document. No third-party recollection. Their own voices connected Nathan to the plan. Miriam listened twice, then said, Save the original and don't touch it again. The next afternoon, Nathan appeared at my door alone. I didn't invite him inside. Dad, Paige is lying about me. Maybe. She planned Hawaii. Maybe. I was scared. I didn't know how to stop her. You could have told me not to board the plane. He looked away. I never wanted you dead. But you were willing to let me get on Flight 417. His head snapped toward me. For the first time since this began, I watched genuine fear spread across my son's face. How do you know about the flight? I didn't answer. Dad, what did you hear? I stepped closer. Enough to know about the capsules. Enough to know what was supposed to happen to my heart at 30,000 feet. Enough to know exactly why $650,000 mattered. Nathan went pale. Who told you? The person your wife forgot was listening. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. I had imagined this confrontation dozens of times. I thought I'd feel satisfaction when Nathan finally realized the truth was no longer his to control. I didn't. I saw the little boy I'd once carried asleep from the car, buried somewhere inside a 43-year-old man who had made choices I might never understand. You had months to tell me the truth, I said. Now you can tell it somewhere that matters. What does that mean? It means I'm done protecting you from what you did. I closed the door. That night, Miriam called with confirmation that the recordings, financial records, disputed signatures, and medical evidence had been transferred to investigators. Nathan and Paige had spent months building a case that Howard Ellison couldn't be trusted. In the end, the strongest evidence against them hadn't come from me at all. It came from their own documents, their own transactions, their own attempts to destroy records, and finally their own voices. The next time Nathan and I would sit in the same room, there would be no private settlement left to negotiate. There would be a judge, attorneys, witnesses, and Flight 417 would finally be heard by everyone. 8 months after I walked off Flight 417 pretending to have chest pain, I entered a courtroom knowing I would finally hear my son explain why he'd been willing to let me stay on that plane. Nathan sat beside his attorney. Paige sat several feet away with separate counsel. They no longer looked like partners. The prosecution began with Renata. She described hearing Paige in the airport restroom, recognizing my age and flight number, and making the decision to warn me before takeoff. Then the courtroom speakers came alive. Paige's recorded voice filled the room. The capsules dissolved fast enough. Then came cardiac event at altitude. Then the sentence, nobody could explain away. 650,000 makes the risk worth it. I watched Nathan lower his head. Renata identified the original file and explained why she'd preserved it. Next came the document evidence. A handwriting specialist compared decades of my genuine signatures with the beneficiary change, power of attorney, and draft will. His conclusion was simple. The disputed signatures were not mine. A bank investigator traced $41,380 in unauthorized transfers and explained how the amounts had been kept small enough to avoid immediate attention. Then, representatives connected to my medical records testified about entries describing confusion and cognitive decline that could not be supported by legitimate appointments. Access records showed irregular activity around several of those notes. Paige's attorney argued that paperwork mistakes happened. That argument weakened when Dr. Annika Ralph took the stand. She described the independent testing ordered during the guardianship case and gave the jury the conclusion Nathan and Paige had tried hardest to prevent. I had full decisional capacity, no clinically significant cognitive decline, and superior analytical functioning for my age. The confused old man in their paperwork had never existed. Then came the emails recovered from Nathan's laptop. Cardiovascular stress. Altitude. Detection timing. $12,000. Nathan's attorney argued that the messages proved curiosity, not intent. The prosecution answered with the recordings from my house. Paige's voice came first. Flight 417 failed. Then we moved to Plan B. Nathan asked what Plan B was. Paige answered, incompetency. Finally came my son's own question. How fast can we do it? Nobody in the courtroom moved. The last recording was worse. Nathan and Paige could be heard blaming each other after receiving Miriam's filing. Paige said Nathan knew what the capsules were for. Nathan answered that she'd said it would look natural. Then she reminded him of the fact he could never erase. And you still got on Flight 417. When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the witness stand and swore to tell the truth. I described the Hawaii invitation, Paige's questions about my medication, the warning aboard the plane, and the months I spent pretending to be confused after discovering what had been done. Nathan's attorney stood. Mr. Ellison, if you genuinely believed your son was involved in an attempt to harm you, why didn't you immediately confront him? I looked at Nathan before answering. Because I spent 40 years teaching chemistry. The attorney frowned. What does chemistry have to do with this? Everything. I taught my students 3 rules. Record everything, trust the data, and verify before concluding. I paused. Nathan was my son. I wanted the evidence to prove me wrong. For the first time that day, Nathan looked directly at me. Did it? The attorney asked. No. The verdict came after 2 days of deliberation. The jury found Nathan and Paige responsible on the major fraud and conspiracy counts presented against them. Additional penalties and restitution followed through the court process. I felt no triumph when the verdicts were read, Paige cried. Nathan simply stared at the table. I had imagined justice would feel like getting something back. It didn't. Margaret was still gone. The son I remembered still existed only in memories. And no verdict could return the months before Flight 417 when I believed my family was taking me to Hawaii because they wanted me there. What justice gave me was something quieter, control of my own life. After the case, I permanently removed Nathan from every position of financial authority. I rewrote my estate plan with Miriam. Most of what remained would eventually fund the Lantern Scholars Fund, providing scholarships for first-generation students studying chemistry, engineering, and other sciences. Miriam asked whether I was certain. Nathan is still your son. He is, I said. But inheritance isn't proof of love, and money isn't forgiveness. A year after Flight 417, Renata visited the scholarship program's first small ceremony. Before leaving, she asked whether I ever wondered what would have happened if I'd ignored her warning. Every day, I said. Does that frighten you? I thought about the question. No, it reminds me to pay attention. That evening, I returned home and found one of Margaret's old photographs on my desk. Nathan was 9 years old in it, sitting on my shoulders at the county fair. I didn't throw it away. What he'd done as an adult didn't erase the child I'd loved, just as loving that child couldn't erase what the adult had done. Both things could be true. That may have been the hardest lesson of all. For 40 years, I taught young people that evidence doesn't care what conclusion makes us comfortable. Sometimes the truth confirms what we hope, sometimes it destroys it. But refusing to look never changes the result. Flight 417 taught me that lesson in a way no laboratory ever could. A stranger noticed something I was too close to see. She warned me. I listened. And when the people I loved tried to convince the world that I could no longer trust my own mind, I returned to the principle that had guided my entire life. Record everything. Trust the data. Verify before concluding. Because sometimes the most dangerous lie isn't the one someone tells you. It's the one you keep telling yourself because the truth hurts too much to accept.